Primero que nada quería agradecer al BID porque realmente logró algo que mi mamá ha estado tratando de hacer por muchos años, que es que volviera a Chile después de tanto tiempo. ¿Ah? Quiero empezar hoy contándoles un poco qué es lo que nosotros hemos estado haciendo, pero también cómo estas cosas se usan. Y para eso quiero comenzar con un video, que es un video que realizamos para un evento en el cual lanzamos un observatorio de datos económicos para España en conjunto con el rey y otras grandes autoridades. So what I want to do next is tell you a little bit of what has changed in this field, the new things that we're doing, but also how this is being used in practice. And to do that, I want to motivate this by telling you that actually people care about economic complexity. Mixing artificial intelligence or machine learning with economic development is not just an academic curiosity, but it's something that has become important for many countries. One of them is Malaysia. Malaysia's new industrial master plan sets economic complexity as the #1 target or the #1 mission of their economy. In Europe, you might be familiar with the famous Draghi report. Last September, Mario Draghi released a report about European competitiveness, and one of the things that they wanted to do was to understand if Europe was leading or lagging in key technologies related to sustainability or related to digitization. What techniques did they use to understand if Europe was lagging or leading compared to the US or China? Well, they used the concept of relatedness from the economic complexity literature. In the UK, the way that they're thinking about their government strategy in the Office of Science is using again these ideas. So these ideas have made it to the world, and now we understand that there's a future in which we need to continue to improve them because these ideas are useful. They allow us to understand economies at a high level of granularity. But what's new in this space? We started this space many years ago using trade data. And we use that trade data to explain international variations in economic growth, inequality, and emissions. And many people were able to reproduce these findings. But we also understood during this period that there are important limitations of using economic complexity measures derived from trade. One of them is that trade data tends to be very biased in favor of countries that are integrated to the value chains of their neighbors. So when you use trade data to measure economic complexity, you're going to get a very high score for Slovakia or Mexico because they're integrated to the value chains of United States or Germany in that case. And you're going to get a very low score for a country like Australia, which exports a lot of raw materials, but will have an intuition that something else must be going on. So for about a decade, people tried to fiddle with the formula and see if they could improve upon this by changing the way that we calculated these vectors. But what we had a few years ago was a simpler idea. It says maybe that information is not hidden in trade data, it's hidden in other sources. What if we grab data from patents or research papers and calculate measures of economic complexity just like the ones that we calculated with trade and see how complementary they are to those? And when we use, for example, patent data and we replace products by technological categories, we get a measure of complexity in which Mexico all of a sudden is not doing so great and Australia is doing fantastic. And when we do research, Australia is doing really great, and countries like Chile are also doing much better than if we only were to look at export products. So we were able to find those complementarities, and those complementarities actually led to better models when it came to explaining future economic growth and international variations in inequality and emissions. Actually, our latest forecasts tell us that the world, is different from the one where we grew up. It's a world in which most of the growth that we're going to experience over the next decade is going to be concentrated on South and Southeast Asia. The #1 country in terms of growth forecast, according to economic complexity, is going to be India. Another big economies that are going to be growing are those of Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. But we wanted to go even beyond the data sets that people have been able to collect, the administrative records on trade, patents, and papers. So we decided to go after digital products. And this was motivated in part by conversations that I was having with people at central banks, which they also wanted to know about digital trade, and they were unable to produce that data themselves. Because there's something uncomfortable about digital trade, which is this mode 3 of trade, in which if you are in Europe and you buy something in Amazon, it appears that you bought something from Luxembourg, when in reality that's not the case. If you're in the United States and you use TikTok, you're doing a digital export to the Cayman Islands. Well, that's not really the case. There's a source that is different from the fiscal residency of many of these firms. So what we did is, again, we used the advantage of being good at machine learning in my team, and we collected corporate revenue data and digital consumption patterns to create a detailed data set of digital trade for hundreds of countries, dozens of sectors, and thousands of firms. And I'm going to give you a couple of nuggets. The first one is that digital trade is a train that you don't want to miss because it's growing much faster than other forms of trade. It's growing at 25% annualized growth rate per year. That's enormous, for any macroeconomic statistic. The other one is that it has a very different geography. Every country exports and imports because eventually you need to export so you can buy the things that you're not able to do. But when it comes to digital, you can be a net importer. You can import digital and you can buy that using your physical product exports. So there are countries like the United States that in the current discourse, maybe they think that they have a trade deficit, but in reality, they have an enormous digital product trade surplus when you consider, these effects. A state like California, if you look at merchandise product statistics, would appear to have a large deficit, but in reality, it's exporting a lot through routers and it's importing through physical ports. And finally, these are sectors that are high complexity. So when we include them into our complexity statistics, the value, for instance, for the United States or Singapore gets revised up, because of this effect. So how are these ideas being put into practice? And one way in which we put these ideas into practice is by putting them in the hands of people, not just in their minds, by creating tools that allow them to explore this information. So one example is Data Saudi, which is a platform that we have built together with the Ministry of Economy and Planning on Saudi Arabia and has become a flagship data distribution system for the economy of the kingdom. Another example is Data Mexico, which is something that we built together with the Secretary of the Economy of Mexico, and it's a very comprehensive data distribution system that includes data not only generated by the Secretary of the Economy, by a number of different government entities. And another example is the OEC, which is a platform that we developed more than 15 years ago now, and that makes available international trade data, at the subnational level for a large number of countries. And the reason why we build this is because of this very simple but profound idea, which is that the best time to build a fire station is before the fire. So many of you work in government and you're putting out fires all the time. There's always things going wrong that you're going to have to take care of. And that's a reality of working on a large organization or working with large numbers of people. And if you always try to react to those things and build something once the problem happens, you're always going to be playing catch-up. So the idea of building a fire station is not because there's a fire, but because there could be a fire in the future. And there's always unexpected fires happening. In 2020, that fire was COVID. Today, that fire might be related to tariffs. And if you don't build that infrastructure first, you're not going to be well prepared to deal with that fire. So let me give you 3 examples. In 2019, we started working with the Secretary of the Economy of Mexico to build Data Mexico. And in 2020, the world changed. Everybody had to work from home, including people that were working as diplomats for Mexico around the world. But since we had been preparing, we were able to release Data Mexico, and we empowered the entire Mexican diplomatic units to use this platform in their foreign direct investment and export promotion efforts. And it was an extremely successful program in which the central government of Mexico trained people across the world to use Data Mexico to generate content, to use them in the presentations, and to help attract that foreign direct investment and to support their export promotion efforts in a world in which everybody could only meet on Zoom. Another example is some work that we have been doing with colleagues in Indonesia. People in Indonesia are very worried about trade. It's a country that used to be specialized in raw materials, but has been industrializing. They export more garments, and now they export more electronics. And they wanted to know if tariffs on China would create an opportunity for them. So we created a simulation tool that is very intuitive and easy to understand. For example, if the United States were to impose a 10% tariff on China, we would experience, a decrease in Chinese exports to the United States, but there would be other countries that would jump in to fill in those gaps. Maybe the exports from Mexico, Canada, and Vietnam would go up. We could see also which sectors in China would be the ones that are most affected, according to this model. And then, looking at those sectors, we could also see which are the countries that would benefit the most. In the case of Indonesia, we would expect, for instance, that a 10 percentage point increase on tariffs from the United States to China would not benefit palm oil exporters, but would benefit enormously people in the footwear industry, in textile footwear, rubber footwear, or people who manufacture trunks and cases and other forms of garments. And the last example is one that we have not released yet, and it's a project that we're working together with people in Mexico. As you know, the value chain of Mexico and the United States are deeply integrated. So a product like cars that Mexico exports a lot to the United States includes many inputs, some of which are made primarily in Mexico and other inputs that are made in the United States. So now here you can see the product, you can see all of the inputs that it takes, and you can see that, for instance, a input that they use, such as clutches, el embrague, is produced primarily in the United States. So therefore, if there would be a tariff on cars, there would be an indirect or ricochet tariff that would be applied on this product, because this product would have traveled first from the United States to Mexico, but then traveled back to the United States inside the vehicle in value added and would be getting taxed again. And of course, we can do this for any sector. So if tomorrow the conversation is not about cars, it's about electronics, we can do that as well, because, not to be repetitive, maybe the best time to build an ark is before the flood. Thank you.
We can come back to our great panel. Cesar talked to us about the vital role new technologies play. For example, machine learning and AI, and how they can help boost growth in countries. This seminar will focus on how to use technological innovation to end poverty. The first step in reducing poverty is domestic growth. And that's Cesar's field. But we can also use technology to figure out what poor communities need support. We can use it to assess our programs, the ones that we use to end poverty, to see if they're actually working. And so I have a question for all of the panelists to kick things off. Just if you can think for a second that you were surprised by technology because of how it could use the vulnerable.
Think about one time when the technology completely surprised you and how it could help the poor and vulnerable.
Minister, we're in your home, and so let's start with you. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I think it's really important to think about this discussion in my context as a Minister of Social Development and Family, and how we include technological advances in how we protect the public. Technology also, being the result of human work, has transformed our lives. We've seen all kinds of technology, from developing electricity and fire and vaccines, just a few examples. Nowadays, as we think about new opportunities offered by technology, some of which we have already seen, I think that we actually have the duty of using it to address social inequality. And that is the backdrop against which we have taken on this challenge at the Ministry of Social Development and Family. And I do have a few examples I'd like to share that has to do with the information we have and how we have been utilizing it to better reach our target public. In the ministry, we have the Social Household Registry. In Chile, it covers over 85% of the population, but it is continuously improving. It includes administrative data, it improves interoperability between databases. It may seem somewhat basic as you think about all the information the government has, but over the last few years, we have been working on incorporating all of this. And what does that do? It helps us automate social services. It helps people stay away from burdensome bureaucracy, from fragmentation of services. And one specific example was the family allowance, which was automated. This started in 2023. It helps children and at-risk youth. And thanks to that automated process and moving away from traditional bureaucracy, we're able to actually have this coverage reach 1,500 children that previously were not receiving this assistance. So we can start to think about that as we continue moving forward, how to keep pushing the envelope. We need to have the kind of infrastructure that helps us use this technology to improve social well-being and address inequality. Thank you very much. Yes, I agree. That is a duty.
Now, Minister Prasad, we'll come back to your experience and your deep experience in Guyana in a few minutes. But first, something that has surprised you about how technology can really help the poor.
I don't believe technology is a surprise because look at us. We have a cell phone that's an extension of our hands. And what we have managed to do is to harness technology and to look at the advent of newer forms of technology and utilize them towards improving systems, ensuring, like in the case of Guyana, how we can use them for inclusivity, accessibility, transparency, and developing state-of-the-art solutions. A simple thing like crowdsourcing can be utilized through a cell phone where a question is pitched to anyone from your population to even those who are using your systems or even those persons who have to utilize the systems to offer services, and you're able to have feedback from a few questions. I think that's key. And while it is not a surprise, I think it's impactful because you always want, when you utilize technology of any sort, that you're able to engage and have direct feedback about its impact and also to have the capacity right then to analyze the data that's coming in. So crowdsourcing is just one, but with the advent of artificial intelligence and the way in which it is being used to have personalized experience and the way at which it's used in having persons have the benefit of interfaces from their home is also very important in all of this that we're doing. In Guyana, we are revolutionizing our digital architecture. We are literally moving our country from a paper-type system to a paperless system at the moment, and that has allowed us to take a quantum leap in the shortest possible time, harnessing all the facets of technology, from creating a registry management system where we look at our beneficiary documents and ensuring that we deal with large data sets, ensure that we are targeting the most vulnerable of the populations, and also looking at how, as government, we can increase efficiency, effectiveness, and have that broad impact that we want to see happen in our country.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Minister. Talking about having technology within reach to be able to see how from a macro level you can use it in systems to improve our social protection systems is absolutely vital.
Cesar.
So I think when people think about technology, we tend to think about gadgets or things, and I want to think about the opposite, which is the process of making them and how that can be transformative to society and help the poor. So there is a paper that we completed recently with Ed Glaser, in which we looked at the trajectory of people that were poor in Brazil that migrated to a city, and we wanted to know which cities were better at lifting people from poverty. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the first finding is not surprising. In the north of Brazil, people escape poverty at a lower rate than in the south of Brazil. Mm-hmm. But wanted to know why. So when we started to explore, to try to find a mechanism, first we found, okay, well, the composition of the industries in the south of Brazil is very different from that of the north. We can say it has higher complexity, but what about complexity is the one that is making people escape poverty? And what we discovered is that because we had very rich data, we could see if there was social mixing at the workplace among people with different levels of skill and different levels of income. So in the north of Brazil, all of the well-educated people, not all, but on average, most educated people work in the government, and lowly educated people or people with less levels of education, they work in the fields and they don't mix and there's no learning. And in the south, in these more complex industries, there's people with high level of skill and people with lower level of skill that are working together, and these people with low level of skills get to learn, get to progress, and they get to escape poverty more effectively. So it's not just about having access to a gadget, it's working on things that are of higher complexity, that require a bigger division of labor, actually helps people escape poverty. And I think we want to think about those processes, not just about the devices.
Absolutely fascinating, completely agree. It goes beyond the machines in our hands.
Josh, one surprising finding.
Yeah, thanks, David. I thought I would share an example that I thought was surprising in two ways. It was surprising both because of how it illustrates the potential for technology, but also some of the limits of technology. So in my group at UC Berkeley, a lot of our focus is on designing state-of-the-art technologies to process satellite imagery and data from private sources for social protection programs. And for a long time, I've collaborated with a humanitarian organization called Give Directly that specializes in providing cash assistance to very poor households. And they had a very innovative early use of satellite imagery. So about 10 years ago, when satellite imagery first became commercially available, very high-resolution satellite imagery of rural villages, they started using this technology without any AI, without any machine learning, just to take aerial images of the regions that they served, and they would have analysts circle on the images the houses that looked the poorest. And this was a really important operational part of their programs, because it was very costly for them to figure out how to determine which households were poor and which households were non-poor. And so they built some programs that were very innovative at the time using this high-resolution satellite imagery. But what was surprising, maybe not surprising, is how quickly households in these villages realized that the houses that had thatched and grass roofs were receiving benefits from this organization, and the households with metal roofs were not. And so the organization had to throw away this program within a couple years, because they realized that households were either delaying or canceling plans to upgrade their dwellings because they wanted to remain eligible for the cash transfers that were going to the households with thatched roofs. And so I use this example because I think it's really powerful. It both highlights how new technology can really unlock innovative use cases in anti-poverty programs, but it also highlights how you really have to consider the socio-technical ecosystem, how people react to the new technologies that are being used in programs.
Thank you so much.
That also highlights some of the risks that we face and the incentives that people have to deal with. Now, let's see if we can get a little bit deeper into this. The only way to use most of these technologies is if we have wider adoption. So Cesar, going back to what you said during your presentation, you have shown that machine learning and AI can be absolutely vital in boosting growth in countries. But not all countries are adopting these technologies, at least not at the same pace. Why not? I think that there are major differences. Some of them can be cultural. The perception or how open and the buy-in in a given society towards these technologies, that can all make a difference. In France, for example, where I live, we see a lot of skepticism around these technologies, foreign companies in these industries, and it is also a continent that has been at the forefront of developing regulations, and that can protect but also has made innovation in Europe more complex. You know, when I go to Indonesia or the UAE, I see a completely different world. And it's interesting then, because when you go to Southeast Asia, technology is seen as a major ally with a lot of growth potential, and the attitude towards it is very different to what we see in Europe, for example. And they're actually trying to grow their digital and technology and national industry using a very different vision. In Korea, for example, we see something very different from Europe. A lot of markets for the sale of data have been developed and structured, and that has allowed many people to gain access to data that can all be aggregated to build products or to do research. And so there are a lot of differences there. And in the West, sometimes we forget that we're only 1/5 of the world. Sometimes we think that we are the whole planet. And when you look at those different cultural differences, perceptions, I think that can heavily influence the roads that we take that lead to technology development, how quickly things move forward, and all of that leads to differences in the long term as well. Thank you. Just a quick follow-up. Is there something countries can do to lead to a shift in attitude? Well, I think it's important to actually have that leadership. Those who look towards others, not only to think about what to do, but also what opinions to develop, and looking at what can be done in different places. If these can be positive examples, that can be a really important step to take. But when there's an ecosystem that's going against that, that can also be a major hindering fact. great. Adoption is good, but it's obviously not only about adoption, but also use.
Minister, we heard a little bit in your initial response about how Guyana is using these technologies. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how we can use technology to identify who needs help and then to deliver services to those people. What's Guyana doing?
Ghana is doing quite a lot, and it's really taking us from a point where there was relatively little digitization to where we're going now when there's complete digitization. And so we have looked at the identification part of the process by using geospatial technology, a little of what Josh spoke of. And we are able to not only identify the vulnerable populations, but we are able to plot the distance people will have to travel to access our services. And also, we have quite an extensive hinterland region, and there the terrain is quite challenging. So with that terrain, we have to understand how people can access our services, bearing in mind we want to have inclusivity, that everyone must have equal benefits. And so the ministry that I head is the Ministry of Human Services and Social Security. And you will appreciate, because I say human, it involves everyone, from senior citizens' benefits or pensions, to people living with disability having their assistance, and persons out there who are vulnerable having assistance at all. And so it is ensuring that when we are providing that service or those assistances, we are looking at the economy, what our fiscal space is like, and ensuring that at all times the solutions that we come up with are able to be not only efficient and effective, but also to be cost effective as well. So utilizing geospatial technology is key in mapping where people are, how they use our services, what kind of services we need to put in place, and what are the cost implications for us as government and also for the beneficiaries who are utilizing our services. In addition to that, we are transitioning large data sets of all the populations that I mentioned into a large registry that will allow us to shorten the time that people have service delivery. Whereas before, an application may have to come from very far in the hinterland among the indigenous population. It might take days. We're now looking at offline solutions where there's input of data. It goes to a central server. That application is processed, and thereafter, instead of someone waiting quite a long time, they're able to have their benefit in short order. We're also looking at how we can utilize payment systems, and we have been doing all of these things that I'm telling you about. Perhaps the challenge in all of this is to make sure that your data is validated, your data is authenticated, and that would be the challenge in getting us to where we need to go. In addition to all of that, we're expanding further to ensure there is an integrated model where not only within this ministry, but multi-sectorally, interagency-wide, we're able to link with other agencies to be able to understand how people are benefiting and to ensure that they get the benefits and the support that they need. So things like case management, registries of things like persons who experience violence, looking at cases of child abuse, looking at cases of gender, and how we are able to mainstream all of that is being built in. This requires support and investment. So government is looking at a larger country model, but these are pockets that will fit nicely into that model when we speak of things like e-government and the one EID that will help us to identify people and properly ensure that they're served. So we would have benefited significantly from IADB through an investment policy loan and through technical cooperation and grants. And all of these things combined with the political will and the willingness to embrace technology would have really allowed Guyana to transcend from where we were and move to where we are. And definitely the road ahead is a good one, because we are able now to have data analytical capacity, we're able to have excellent data collection, and we are able in a lot of ways to ensure that the key people who require our services are benefiting from those services.
Thank you so much.
The ability to gather data, to analyze them, to identify those who need support is absolutely key. And I actually want to delve a little bit deeper into that. We would all love to provide benefits to everyone, but we simply don't have the fiscal capacity to do that, unfortunately. So let's look at that more deeply.
Josh, can you give us, as we think a little bit more about this identification, can you give us a concrete example of how to use technology to do this? Dig into the weeds a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. So I can actually build very much on the minister's comments. I think earlier I talked about how this one humanitarian organization faced this difficulty of identifying poor households in rural villages. But of course, this is a challenge faced by social protection agencies and government policies across the globe. So a lot, probably 75% of my current work involves collaboration with agencies like this to figure out if and how, and I'll come back to this later, like AI and machine learning might assist in this identification. We refer to it as the targeting question. So a concrete example. This is an example of a partnership with the Minister of Social Protection in Togo, a small country in West Africa. And so I first got connected to this Minister Lawson, at the height of the pandemic in Africa, right as things were really getting bad in Africa. And she had approached me because she had heard that my lab was capable of taking satellite imagery and rather than having analysts label each household, using artificial intelligence to create high-resolution photos into estimates of poverty rates at the village level or at the square kilometer level, very, very granular. And as the minister, she had a very large budget that she was responsible for distributing into rural villages. But at Togo at the time, there was no accurate poverty map. There was no administrative data set that she had access to that would tell her which were the poorest and the poorest households with the greatest need for government support. And so over the course of, the last census in Togo had been done about 15 years prior. There was no uniform national ID system like you have here in Chile, and there was nothing related to like a national social registry. So we started working. It takes a couple weeks to build these satellite models that can process this and identify poor villages. But I bring up this example because that was really only the start. And what became really exciting and innovative was when we brought in more ministers and the private sector into the collaboration. Because through a combination of not just satellite data, but also data from mobile phone and mobile money operators, we found that we could identify not just poor villages or poor regions, but also the poorest subscribers, the poorest individuals in the country through this confluence of data. Now, how does it work is probably more than I have time to describe here, but the intuition is simple. Just like poor locations look different from wealthy locations in an image, if you look at the data footprints that people generate, very poor people generate different data footprints than non-poor people. If it's phone data, maybe they spend less on their phone each month, or they have a different device, or they make a different number of international calls. But through a combination of qualitative surveys, as well as very technical machine learning algorithms, we could design models that would actually estimate something like a proxy means test, a means test, of an individual person's wealth, whether they were poor or not. Now, of course, no system is perfect, and we wrote many papers about how these machine learning algorithms have their limitations. But for someone like the minister in Togo, the question isn't whether or not this machine learning algorithm is perfect. It's whether or not it's better than the other things available. Because in Togo in 2020, at the height of the pandemic, with a 15-year-old census, there's going to be exclusion errors in this program no matter what. And so a lot of the work we did was to really carefully analyze the types of exclusion errors that would be caused by one system versus another. And it turned out in Togo that this particular system that used satellite imagery, mobile phone data, and machine learning reduced the overall exclusion errors by about 50%. Wow. So I bring up this example because it's a very specific use of a very specific technology at a very specific time in a very specific place. It's not to say that this particular solution would work everywhere. There's lots of concerns about privacy, about transparency, about manipulation. Just like the people learned that the satellite imagery was being used, maybe you'd worry that people would learn how to use their phones differently. And so these are considerations that, happy to engage on through questions or later, but illustrate some of the, again, scope, but also limitations of technology.
Thank you very much, Josh. Perhaps this may not be the case in Chile, but in other countries in the region, there are they have data constraints like the ones you mentioned. So there hasn't been consensus in written years, and there are no recent surveys, so that would open a door. So let's move from Guyana and Togo and come back down to the south, to Chile. We talked about identification and adoption, but how do we evaluate our programs? I think we're dealing with more frequent crises, be they economic, natural disasters. So the question I have for you, Minister, is, in addition to what you already told us, how is Chile harnessing technology to evaluate its own programs and also to respond to specific types of crises? I'll start with the last part because we do have challenges here as other countries in the world do. We've had natural disasters. And to answer your last question, how do we use technology to be better equipped to handle a natural disaster, and how do we do that in advance? We do face challenges in achieving adaptive protection. We are earthquake prone in Chile, so we do have an installed capacity to deal with an emergency, and it's fairly well developed. It enables us to protect human lives. We have disaster risk maps. When it comes to social protection, that is not the case. We lack highly developed instruments to deal with those situations, and yet the technology infrastructure we do have has helped us to better deal with these challenges. Under normal circumstances, we have social programs that identify beneficiaries in a very targeted way. So when there is a disaster, it's not as much of a challenge to reach much larger population groups as happened with the pandemics or with large-scale forest fires as the ones we've grappled with recently. And I would say that some of the steps I mentioned in my previous answer were key in enabling us to deal with the pandemic. Once the authorities decided to provide monetary allowances to most families, we did have ways to act very quickly. We had a social registry of households, and we were able to digitize it using one code, a code that is practically universal. Also, we have banking services and universal access to banking services. So all of those things made it possible for us to accelerate the delivery of monetary transfers. And those instruments have been fine-tuned, and they have been used for situations we've experienced over the last 3 years with forest fires, also with floods. And we do have infrastructure that makes it possible for us to quickly move when there is an emergency to deliver cash transfers that are delivered within the first 10 days of an emergency to affected populations. We've also been able to take steps to broaden access to banking services. We have an electronic emergency transfer which can be accessed through the Root platform, which almost everybody in Chile has access to. So it's possible to take these tools and move very quickly with them once they have been developed, and that has provided us with much better infrastructure. We're able to use satellite data. The Ministry of Housing is doing this. They still face challenges, but during the large-scale fire we had in Valparaiso, which affected many households, it was possible to assess the damage. Before, this was done going house to house with professional personnel, and that had its merits, but here we needed to quickly find out the level of damages, and using satellite data and drones, we were able to do something that could have taken 3 to 4 months. We were able to do it very quickly. So we are taking steps. We still have a long way to go, and we try to come up with the best way of providing social protection in the context of each disaster. So we have to see what works best, how we deliver assistance. But because we do have the tools already, we are able to use them in these different ways. Thank you. It's important to be able to identify and adopt, but in times of crisis, as we saw in the examples of Ghana and Togo and Guyana, we have been able to reach households very quickly before months have gone by and they've had to go back to their daily lives. I have a few more questions. We could spend more time on this, but first I'd like to turn to the audience. We've been getting some questions from the audience. I'd like to start with a question for Minister Prasad.
And so you talked about basically a massive expansion in data services in Guyana and making those data systems speak to each other. So one big question in the context of such an expansion, and Josh mentioned something on this as well, of course, is security. So how is Guyana, in the face of this big expansion, handling cybersecurity, data governance, and privacy?
We have just passed the data protection legislation, so that takes care in terms of the legislative framework of how we plan to protect data. Of course, you know, when people use any system that involves sharing of their data, they're always concerned, and that's a very reasonable concern. So in addition to the legislative arm working to deal with the data protection, it is also imperative that where data is stored, be critical, and who has access to data also key. We have the National Data Management Center, and that is where all of our data is stored, so there is a selectivity in those who can access the data, and in all of the systems being developed, there is also that tiered approach where input may be one aspect of it, but access and utilization is also another aspect of it. And we're also enforcing a lot more pieces of legislation going forward to have that robust response to protecting data.
Mm-hmm. Excelente.
Excellent. I'd like to follow up with the minister with the same subject. Chile has had a data system for years. You have made progress with that, but could you tell us what your thoughts are about privacy and how to protect data? Clearly, it's a very important topic. We have databases at the ministry, and they're critical for decision making, but we have to protect the data. That's essential. Also, trust, people's trust in the public institution. We have a social registry of households, which I mentioned before, but something I did not mention is that we're working on a digital ecosystem program which integrates the household survey and also a one-stop shop for social services, which makes it possible to cross-check the benefits somebody is receiving in the area of health, also from the municipality, the ministry. there are many elements that need to be connected. Also, we have the social data base, which is integrated. The ministry can request data from other ministries as well, but we need to explain very clearly what that information is going to be used for. And then also just recently, we completed the field work on our last socioeconomic survey. It's where we ask households to provide us with their response. It's the second largest survey we conduct, and we have to get people to answer, and they need to trust that this is going to be used for a completely different purpose. And we need to be very clear, why do we collect data? What is the data going to be used for? And we need to build that trust so that we can have different tools, a survey that enables the state to get statistics, which is not the same as a registry, which is used for user identification. So these are different mechanisms, and we need to know how to use them. And we also need to explain how we use them to our citizens so that they will trust them and provide the information. Cesare, do you want to add anything? I would say that all of that is important, but there are other things that we should also take into account. When you're working with data or computerized systems, you could think that there are some solutions that are brute force. You have all the data and you're running them. But there are other solutions that are smarter, which provide privacy protection, for example, simply by design. If I want to know the difference between what you earn and what I earn, instead of asking you, getting my number and figuring out the difference, I can take a much larger number, and if you give me your income plus that number, and I take my income with that number, I automatically get the difference. And this is a simple example. You can do things that are much more complex, and you can do this to share information and really run numbers without ever revealing the original information. So when we're working with tables, we think about encryption, but it is possible to do other things if you work with mathematical models. It's hard to explain. I know that there are many other difficulties, but there is an innovation source there, and it can provide good solutions. So it's important to use all the available tools for security. I'd like to go to another question which came from the audience. You spoke about adoption, identification, and how to deliver services faster.
Ahora, una cosa, Josh, I know something you've been involved with to some degree in your work is evaluating the impact of programs and whether or not programs are working or not. And so, can you say anything to how we can use technology to more rapidly evaluate whether programs are working and then change course?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's actually a really exciting time right now to think about new approaches to policy and impact evaluation. It's really only in the last 5 to 10 years that we, policymakers, researchers, have had access to very pervasive real-time data sources. Satellite imagery is one. So now you can get a photograph of every populated square kilometer of the entire planet every day. That wasn't available even 5 years ago. With financial networks and mobile phone networks, you have near real-time streaming data. And in the last few years, we've seen several examples of cases where researchers and policymakers have used these non-traditional data sources to do impact evaluation. So there was a program in Kenya, an electrification program, where it was staggered out geographically, and they used satellite imagery to see the impacts of this program on local economies without having to do massive survey data collection. Because I think a big constraint to traditional impact evaluation is the time and resources it takes to conduct surveys, to see how living standards are changing. And so these new data sources and new technologies are introducing very low-cost, rapid approaches to, now, they're not as good as a household survey, a consumption survey, but they're a very low-cost proxy that can allow policymakers to see what's working and what's not an order of magnitude faster than would be required if they were waiting for the next nationally representative household survey.
Mm-hmm. Eso es
That's it.
¿no?
Great.
Siempre es que necesitamos la mejor
We don't always need to have the very best tool. In some cases, what we need is something that can quickly tell us if things are on track. And that brings me to another question, also from the audience, for the minister. And it's about the program you referenced, the family subsidy. How can you use technology to monitor progress with the subsidy, especially to gauge the impact on boys, girls, and adolescents? Well, this subsidy is part of our non-contributory social protection system, and it's aimed at children and adolescents, their mother, parents, guardians pay into the system. It also covers people with disabilities, and there's some requirements. One is based on their socioeconomic status, and they also consider health and education pensions for these children based on age. And traditionally, with the traditional family subsidy, individuals had to go to the municipal health facility to request a certificate to prove that their children were receiving the required health care to the age of 6, and the same for other services. So we have databases, and they are interoperative so that we can compare the data without having people make the journey to the different facilities. And again, that boosted trust. Having to go through all those bureaucratic procedures was frustrating for people. I'm not speaking of technologies that are as complex as the one Cesar was describing, but this is something that is helpful and enables us to reach households. So with this benefit, we're able to ensure compliance with the requirements once a year, socioeconomic status, also taking children in to receive the required health care, education, depending on the age of the child. And once those requirements were met, the allowance was paid out automatically. Also, thanks to the administrative data, we do have records that update monthly, and that also enables us to get the information quickly, get the full picture, because there's integration with other databases on taxes, income, everything I mentioned, health, education. So the registry has been another step forward compared to what we used to do. We used to have self-reported information in our files, and now we do have administrative records available. And that brings me back to something Cesar mentioned. When we speak of using new technology, it doesn't always mean a new device. It could simply be a procedure. The minister is now speaking of using technologies that may not be new, but are being used differently in a way that has not been used before, to monitor recipients to see if they are receiving their corresponding benefits. Cesar, if you'd like to add anything, you're welcome to do so, but we have another question, and it comes from, it's about Mexico. You mentioned that there was a project, many stakeholders. What would you say guarantees the success of implementation? Which are the factors? First,
and this is to Josh's point, because I think it's a very important point, and then I'll get into that. So when we're using different technologies to try to understand the population, and I'm talking alternative to service, the big elephant in the room is that probabilistic sample is a gold standard in a world in which people pick up the phone. And that world is no longer our world. So 25 years ago, a lot of these surveys are phone surveys. And people used to pick up the phone, they used to answer things. Now the non-response rates are like 80%, 90% in some cases, and we've seen that cause troubles in, for example, surveys when it comes to trying to understand who's gonna win an election, because the non-response rates are very large. So I think that technologies that people like Josh develop are important, not only because they're like a lesser version of probabilistic sample, is because probabilistic sample, at least when it comes to like phone type surveys, are really not working as well anymore because people simply are not picking up the phone. Now you have to go and knock on the door. It's making probabilistic sampling way more expensive. To your question about the projects that we've done in Mexico, I think there it's really important to be able to engage a wide variety of people that would be doing very specific tasks. And in our case, I think we were very lucky because the Secretary of the Economy was able to coordinate in such a way that, for instance, when it came to train the commercial attaches of the embassies of Mexico around the world, we didn't even have to kind of like be involved in that. Okay, that's great, you guys are doing, and we were working on the design of the tool, on the user interface, on making sure that the data was being updated on time, and we could have that type of multi-stakeholder engagement type of activity. And that is really hard because what I find is that even though governments usually are under the same brand, there's a lot of jealousy between different units and departments, and sometimes it's what makes projects like the ones that we do difficult to implement. You are making a one-stop shop for the data of the entire country, and they want to do that, but everybody wants them to be in their own URL and with their own brand, and that's what kills the project many times, which it's unfortunate because it should be a more collaborative effort, but I've seen it in different type of government systems fail because of that reason.
100%. So, related to these interlocking pieces, another question that we got, and that I think is essential. I think we all know that technology by itself
does not solve poverty. That hinges on how it's used. How does it become part of the system?
Minister Persad, you've talked about these interlocking systems in Guyana and how using the system, how do you keep at the level of government a systemic view for how you're using technology across all of these anti-poverty programs?
I think it's important to have collaboration, discussion, and starting with that at the highest level. So the political will and the collaborative effort should be at that level. And then that should filter down into the agency, and we should also look at who is benefiting. Definitely government will have multi-agencies, multi-sectors, where you have a single beneficiary from each one of these. So I think it's the necessity to look at how every beneficiary is gaining from every sector and look at that person as where you want the outcome to go, in the sense that we must know what it costs the state per person, per family, even per child, and look at the assistance that has been given to each one of those subsets so that as government we can be more effective in our spending. And with that kind of mandate and with that kind of visionary outlook, it then becomes a discussion point among agencies, not to get into the trap that Cesar is talking about, where people want to go on their own tangent, but look at how when we integrate or when we interlock, how effective it is moving someone out of poverty, identifying someone who is vulnerable, and ensuring that you are creating financial independence as one mode of looking at it, and also looking at socioeconomic stability holistically by finding all of these different elements that exist among government. So it really has to start with the leadership level of things. It cannot be something that is done in a technical way and done in pockets. It must always be at that level. And it is imperative that when you do that, you have the discussions, the M&E sessions. Did it work? Did it not work? Can we and should we go back to the drawing table to ensure that our model is financially sound and is having the impact that we want to see? I just want to say one thing on what Josh mentioned. Simply saying crowdsourcing is a valuable tool to get feedback from your population and also to get feedback from stakeholders. It is cost effective, you already have the tool for it, and it is simply creating not the calling on the phone and being very long on the phone, but simple mechanisms of having answers that can be analyzed by the way in which those answers are structured, utilizing existing technology and being able to tailor towards the needs of the population and towards the persons who are providing the services.
Excelente. Thank you so much, Minister.
I would say that what is most important is focusing on the beneficiary. If we think of all our technological systems, the question is, how do you reach each individual beneficiary? Obviously, we make changes at the macro level, but if we're not able to deliver the services, it's not going to work. I would like to spend the rest of the afternoon with the panel, but that is not possible. I've been told that I cannot, but I have learned a few things. I've seen very specific examples of how technology can help us to better identify those who need help, also to assess whether programs are effective and that they are reaching the target groups, especially those that need them the most. We've had very specific examples from within and from outside the region, which we can also adapt to our own context, maybe not identically, but we can help them to eliminate poverty more quickly than we have in the past. I'd like to end with one last question for our panelists. If you had a magic wand and could use it to solve one technological challenge in the fight against poverty, what would you do today?
If you could use a magic wand to eliminate one technological challenge, what would be the first thing to fix? Cesar.
It's tough because I'm a big believer on gradual improvement. So the magic wand that would fix poverty is not, I think, something that I believe. But I think if there is a magic wand that I would want to use, is one that would keep that sense of wonder and openness towards innovation. Because I do think that we're never going to get to the solution, but we're always going to get to a solution that is better than we have right now. And my fear is that sometimes, we think that we are at the end of the journey, and what we have to do is add constraints to our current technology or our current solution. So it would be a magic wand that would restore people's sense of wonder, sense of creativity, so we can continue to move forward and search for what's next.
That was great. So again, this brings us back to the attitudes you mentioned at the beginning.
Josh, how do you use your magic wand?
Well, I really like Cesar's magic wand, so I'll build on that. And mine is much, much more mundane, and it's come up a few times already, but I think it has to do with data access. I wish that people would understand that there are ways to provide access to data that are very useful to anti-poverty policy that also are responsible and that can protect privacy. And I think we've heard 3 different perspectives on ways from institutional perspectives to safeguarding access to privacy-enhancing technologies that create options for enabling data access for responsible uses. And I guess I just wish more people understood that data privacy and data access isn't like a binary. Either you open up all your data and let AI run wild, or you keep your data closed and it's not as innovative, but it's also very safe. There's a whole spectrum in between, and there's a bunch of different perspectives and very well-trod examples and use cases that can provide guidance on how to basically do both.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, right. A non-binary thinking about data use, data availability, data privacy. Minister Persad.
Well, if I was Harry Potter and I had that wand to use, I would definitely want to use it on a lot of things, funding, resources. But I think people. Any system is only as good as the people behind that system. And any system becomes even more successful if the people who should benefit, embrace the system. So I would love to use my wand on people to tell them, don't be afraid of technology. Embrace it, try it, put in all the controls, put in all the mechanisms. It will take time. And like we are now benefiting from technology from aeons ago, we will benefit from the technology that is out there now. So I think getting people into the frame of mind to use the technology and to use it in a way where they see the vision behind the technology and how they will benefit from the use of technology is critical, because we can put some of the best technology to use. But if it fizzles out without the people being at the center of it, then it really does not amount to anything. So that's how I would use my wand. I don't have a spell to cast, but...
Thank you very much.
And with that, we go back to what the minister said earlier, and that is building trust around data gathering and using technology. And so last magic wand goes to the minister. Well, I don't know if I'm going to mention a magic wand, but I think that in combating poverty and inequality, what we have to do is not only think about how we focus and distribute the resources we currently have going towards social benefits, but also think about how to make our economies more complex so that we don't only distribute the existing resources, but how to actually create wealth and grow that wealth and have that improve the lives of individuals. Of course, we have to talk about better distribution of funds and the wealth produced by all people on the planet. And maybe something that makes you think more broadly, this came from the President Boric, who went to the UN last year. I went with him, and he was talking about how we currently talk about global financial governance. That we're daring to speak about what needs to change, and we're talking about modernizing, but also combating illicit financial flows, addressing inequality in tax revenue collection. These are challenges that have different degrees of complexity, but still really important in my view. Something that we need to really focus on. I think that we as people have the ability to generate wealth. We have distribution challenges, but we have tools and technology that allow us to do this. We need to be ambitious. We need to build the kind of momentum we need to address all of it, but it can be done. Of course, we do need to find the best ways to use the technology, share experiences among countries, and look at what we are facing together as challenges. But again, finding fairer wealth distribution, which I think is part of an ethical duty we have to make sure that we are using what we have currently to benefit everyone and to keep building on that. That is a perfect way to end our panel. I'd like to thank our audience, and a special thanks to our panelists. Fantastic. Hand of applause, please.